Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In 1795, a young John Quincy Adams went to Berlin to assume his post as the foreign minister to Prussia. He was made to wait outside the gates of the city for several hours before finally someone came back and confirmed with him that yes, there is a nation called the United States. Now that tells you something about the state of our new nation in the early years of the Republic. Before long, the United States would be well known to everyone around the world. But in the beginning, there were many who didn't even know the nation existed, and many others who questioned whether it would survive at all. So, in this series of lectures, we're going to examine the early years of the Republic, starting with the presidency of George Washington. There were plenty of reasons to doubt whether the United States would survive. Other republics in history had not fared particularly well, and many political thinkers, both within the United States and around the world, did not expect the new nation would last very long. Washington himself at one point said, "I do not expect the Constitution to last for more than 20 years." The early country was beset with all kinds of problems, ranging from internal to external. Internal problems included the question of whether a nation can survive, leaving so many of its important decisions to the uneducated masses. Others wondered whether the presidency would ultimately come to resemble a monarch and seize similar powers. Others thought perhaps the legislature would grow too powerful, particularly the Senate, which resembled an aristocracy or an aristocratic elite like those in Europe. And there were plenty of external problems as well. As we note from this map of North America in 1783, Spain proved a looming presence off to the west. Great Britain still held much territory in North America, located primarily in what is now Canada. And France, while it was largely removed from the North American arena, was always keeping a watchful eye on developments and looking to get back in if an opportunity presented itself. So the new nation and its new president, George Washington, confronted a host of issues. The Constitution had created an Electoral College, which included representatives from each state who would ultimately choose the president. On February 4th, 1789, those electors unanimously selected George Washington to be the nation's first president. That was perhaps the worst kept secret of all time. Everyone understood Washington would be the first president. His vice president was John Adams, another prominent leader of the Revolutionary era, and we'll be talking more about Adams later. So those two were fairly foregone conclusions. Those elections also selected the first Congress. We should note that few anti-federalists were elected to that first Congress, which was dominated by the Federalists. Now, to be clear, the two-party system as we understand it today had really not evolved yet, and we're actually going to talk a lot more about the development of political parties. But there is this kind of ideological divide in the first Congress between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and we'll discuss in the next lecture or two how those kind of early ideological divisions will blossom into political parties. So the first major task of the first Congress was to set about amending the Constitution. Remember that in a number of cases, states ratified the Constitution with the promise that there would be amendments added. And even the Federalists, among them James Madison, had come to understand that there would be amendments added to the new Constitution. And so they set about to craft the first 10 amendments, which we know as the Bill of Rights. So James Madison, who was probably the most prominent of all the congressmen in that first Congress to be elected, set about to craft what became the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Now, those were pared down from dozens of different amendments that had been submitted by the various states for consideration, ultimately whittled down to about a dozen, of which 10 passed through Congress and ultimately were adopted as what we know as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. And you all might note that some of our most famous and cherished rights are set aside, not in the Constitution itself, but in these first 10 amendments to it, the Bill of Rights. The right of free speech, the right to free assembly, the right to bear arms, and so on, are laid out in this very important document. And we talked about this a little bit at the end of the last chapter as perhaps the last lingering great victory of the Anti-Federalists, the Bill of Rights. George Washington and his presidency are enormously important for a host of different reasons, but one of the most significant is that it established precedents that would be honored really throughout our history in many different cases. And we're going to talk about a lot of these precedents along the way. But it isn't really just the fact that he's first, but the fact that he is creating these precedents that would be observed and honored through the passage of time. And really only George Washington at that time had the military experience and authority, the kind of gravitas and seriousness and presence that we talked about when we discussed the Constitutional Convention, to serve as the first president. And understand that when he took office, there was virtually no structure there. So he is painting on a blank canvas. He had only very few officials around him, including a foreign office that consisted of John Jay and a couple of clerks, a 300-pound Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and a standing army of only 672 men, and no navy. There was also heavy national debt and virtually no revenue coming in. So Washington sets about to kind of create the office of the president and the whole executive branch from virtually nothing. Among the things to be decided were, what are we going to call the president? And again, what's in a name? Well, we can debate that, but there were many options that were debated. Among them, John Adams, who favored some sort of very regal title, including His Exalted High Mightiness. Now, could you imagine us calling the president His Exalted High Mightiness now? Others opted for a much more simple, yet deferential Mr. President. And perhaps it says something about our country that we are governed by Mr. President rather than some regal title. The First Lady, Martha Washington, also helped to set the tone for this presidency. She ran the home, decorated, and perhaps most famously cooked. She was a wonderful entertainer who made the presidential home a welcome place for other leaders to visit. Among the other precedents established by Washington were the first cabinet. So when he was inaugurated, there really was no executive department. He needed to create a staff of advisors who would work with him. And Congress authorized the creation of the Departments of State, which would handle foreign affairs, Treasury, and War. It also created the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. And there are many other cabinet officials that have been created since then, but the initial cabinet was very small. And Washington's appointments are important as well. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War. His vice president, I've already mentioned, was John Adams, and John Jay was appointed as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It is worth noting that many of these first cabinet officials, representatives from the Continental Congress and so on, were in essence self-made men. Talent can get one to the top in the United States, as opposed to some sort of aristocratic bloodline. George Washington was a farmer, John Adams was the son of a shoemaker, and Alexander Hamilton, perhaps most famously, any of you who have seen the musical or familiar with it, was an illegitimate child, an immigrant from the Caribbean. So, in this nation, one can make something of oneself regardless of stature at birth. Now, in the next couple of lectures, we're going to talk a lot about this cabinet, some of the divisions and rifts that develop within it that ultimately lead us towards what becomes the two-party system.